Thank you, Mr. Taylor. Now I call on former Ambassador James Bissett.
Thank you very much, Lily. And I'm really delighted to be here at Vanier College. I think it's very important for the students particularly. Some of you were not very old in 1999 when the bombing started. To me it seems just like yesterday, but some of you I'm sure had really no idea about where Kosovo was or is, and not much interest. And that's true, I'm afraid, for the mass of Canadians who one morning 10 years ago woke up to find that their airmen were bombing Serbia, a modern European country which was no threat to any of its neighbors. And we're wondering, where is this Kosovo and why are we bombing these people? My reaction when I heard it was, quite frankly, anger. I had been a diplomat for 36 years, an old Cold War warrior, if you will. I was very proud of NATO. After all, NATO was the organization that was formed in 1949 by Western European countries, Canada and the United States, to make sure that the USSR, the Soviet communists, did not overrun Europe. And NATO was designed to protect our freedoms. Article 1 of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was the key article, the founding article, and it said very clearly that NATO was a defensive organization. NATO would never use or threaten to use force in the resolution of international disputes, and would always act in accordance with the United Nations Charter. And we were proud of NATO, and it did a good job. After the fall of the Soviet Union, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the reunification of Germany, people began to wonder, why do we have this extremely expensive military organization in the middle of Western Europe? What purpose is it serving? And there were beginning to be increasing demands for the dismantling of that organization. The Warsaw Pact armies had gone home years before, and people, as I said, began to question the viability of NATO. That's what, quite frankly, Kosovo was all about. And we began to hear when the bombing started that the Serbs had been persecuting the Albanian population in their Kosovo province, that ethnic cleansing was taking place. Cohen, who is the Secretary of Defense for the United States, claimed that 100,000 young Albanian men were missing. Clinton, Tony Blair assured us that genocide was taking place, and that NATO was justified in its bombing of Serbia to stop the butcher of the Balkans, President Milosevic, from eliminating all of the Albanian population in Kosovo. We found out later, and we know now, that those were lies. Our political leaders, NATO, were lying to us. Those of you who watched the film before this will know that when the forensic experts poured into Kosovo after the Serb security forces had left, they began to look for these 100,000 dead bodies. They haven't been able to find them. The last count, UN figure, I think, is 2008 or 2018 bodies have been found. We were also told that ethnic cleansing was taking place. But if that also was a lie, because the mass exodus of Albanians out of Kosovo started when the bombing started. And the United Nations figures have proven that, and I've seen them. There were a lot of Albanians displaced during the 2 or 3 years of quite serious fighting that was taking place in Kosovo. But they were not refugees, they were displaced from the villages where the fighting had taken place. But the mass exodus of Albanians took place after the bombing started. So Kosovo, from my point of view, is a classic example of where humanitarian intervention is used as an excuse or as a cover for other reasons. The major reason for the bombing of Kosovo was to restore in the minds of the public that NATO was a worthwhile organization, was a defender of freedom, and could be still extremely useful even if it was in the middle of Europe. That's the reason for Kosovo and the bombing. And it's a lesson that we should all learn, because it proved very, very convincingly that governments can mislead the people. And a compliant media who are not interested in getting out and really exploring the facts will follow what the government propaganda machine tells them. Not only that, the bombing, of course, was completely illegal. It was in violation of international law, it was in violation of the United Nations Charter, and it was in violation of NATO's own Article 1, which said that it would never use force in the resolution of international disputes, wouldn't even threaten to use force. That's where, in my view, that's the most serious consequence of the NATO bombing, because it set a dreadful precedent. It showed that the United States-led NATO countries would no longer abide by the United Nations Charter and would no longer abide by international law. And in the middle of the bombing, this was what it was all about, in the middle of the bombing in April of 1999, President Bill Clinton, Tony Blair, and the other NATO leaders celebrated NATO's 50th birthday. And on that occasion, Bill Clinton, on his own, announced a new role for NATO. And in effect, that new role was, and still is, that NATO now will not have to abide by international law, will not have to abide and act in accordance with the United Nations Charter or the principles of the UN Charter, but will intervene militarily wherever in the world it feels necessary to do so. And that is where we are now with NATO. And that started because of the bombing of Kosovo. It's gone completely unnoticed. After all, no one in Canadian Parliament debated whether our airmen should participate in the bombing of Serbia. Most of our members of Parliament didn't know where Kosovo was. There was no debate or discussion in Parliament. The Canadian people had nothing to say about whether their airmen would participate in the strikes. And you'll see that if you'd seen the film earlier today, you'll see what those airstrikes did. They had no effect whatsoever on the Serb military, but they destroyed the civilian infrastructure of a modern European country. They bombed cigarette factories, automobile factories. They blasted down the bridges on the Danube, which had absolutely no military significance. They destroyed the electrical grid. They hit television stations. They even, as you know, bombed the Chinese embassy. Said it was a mistake. It wasn't a mistake. They'd heard that the Chinese were alerting the Serbs on when flights from Italy were coming in to bomb. And so they took out the Chinese embassy. They killed about 4,000 civilians, double the casualties that they alleged had been taking place in Kosovo. So I mean, they were dropping and dropped over 200,000 some cluster bombs on Serbia. Many of them are still